No one looks up. That is the first thing you need to understand about all of this. We have been trained, systematically, culturally, psychologically, not to look up, to keep our eyes at street level, to accept the horizon they gave us as the only horizon that ever existed. But what if the street you are standing on is not the original ground? What if the doors that open 10 feet above your head once opened to a world so vast, so vertically complex, so functionally integrated across multiple levels of human movement, that the civilization responsible for it makes everything built since look like a rough draft? What if the Skywalks are still there? What if they never left? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will never walk past a building the same way again. Let us start with what we can all see. Go to any major city built before 1900. It does not matter the continent. It does not matter the culture. You will find them. Scholars call them blind doors. Architects call them false entries. Tourism boards call them decorative features. I call them orphaned thresholds. Because a threshold is not decoration. A threshold is a passage. It is the physical demarcation between here and there, between inside and outside, between one world and another. And someone built these thresholds with extraordinary care, with cut stone, with wrought iron, with load-bearing lintels strong enough to support not just a door but traffic, repeated, heavy daily traffic. Consider an archway in Edinburgh, Scotland. A full arched entry, perfectly proportioned, carved from sandstone, beginning at approximately 18 feet above the modern pavement level. It has decorative corbels underneath it. Corbels are structural brackets. You use them when something needs support. You do not carve elaborate structural brackets beneath a window dressing. That is not how architecture works. That is not how engineering logic works. Now consider the Carraghi district in Genoa, Italy, one of the densest medieval to Renaissance urban fabrics in all of Europe. There you find not just one orphan threshold, but a sequence of them. 3 connected arched openings at identical heights, running along the face of a building for nearly 40 meters, all beginning at the same elevation, approximately 12 feet above the current street. Historians will tell you these are remnants of arcaded walkways, medieval shops, covered markets. And I want to take that explanation seriously, because that is what intellectual honesty demands. But here is the problem with that explanation. Arcaded walkways have floors. They have ground-level entries. The whole point of an arcade is that it meets the pedestrian where the pedestrian is. These structures do not do that. These structures begin in midair and end in midair. The floor they once connected to is gone, and what replaced that floor is not renovation, not demolition. It is fill, compacted earth, silt, centuries of accumulated sediment pressed down by the weight of time itself. Which brings us to the central question of this entire investigation. What happened to the ground? If you have been in this research community for any length of time, you have encountered the mudflood theory. And if you are brand new, welcome, buckle up. The core claim is this. At some point in the relatively recent past, most researchers place this event somewhere between the 1600s and the mid-1800s. A catastrophic geological or atmospheric event deposited massive quantities of sediment across populated regions of the planet. Not everywhere equally, but in concentrated zones that correspond almost perfectly with the locations of the world's great pre-industrial cities. This was not a flood in the way we think of floods, not a wall of water that crashes through and recedes. This was more like what geologists call a debris flow, thick, dense, moving with terrible purpose, capable of filling the lower stories of buildings in hours. Now mainstream geology acknowledges debris flows. It acknowledges that cities are built on top of older cities. It even acknowledges something called accumulated refuse level, the phenomenon where the gradual buildup of garbage, construction debris, and organic matter raises street level over time. But here is where the mainstream account runs into serious trouble. In Rome, street level has risen by approximately 9 meters since antiquity. 9 meters, that is 30 feet. And mainstream archaeology largely attributes this to garbage accumulation. They are asking you to believe that the citizens of one of history's most administratively sophisticated civilizations simply piled their trash for 1,000 years until they were living on top of a 30-foot mound of refuse. In Istanbul, ancient Constantinople, excavations for the modern metro system in the 2000s broke through what engineers expected to be soft soil and instead discovered a fully intact Byzantine harbor, with ships, with warehouses, with administrative buildings. All of it sealed under a layer of sediment so dense and so uniform that the archaeologists who found it initially could not believe what they were looking at. That is not garbage accumulation. In Philadelphia, a city incorporated in 1682, historical records show that by the mid-19th century, the city undertook massive street-raising projects. Officially documented efforts to elevate road levels by 8 to 12 feet across large portions of the downtown core. The official reason given was drainage. They wanted to improve water runoff. But here is what that explanation glosses over. You do not raise a street by 12 feet for drainage. You raise a street by 12 feet because the original ground level has become inaccessible, because something happened to it, because the streets you are building on top of are not streets anymore, they are ceilings. And above those buried streets, those sealed forgotten corridors, the buildings still stand. Their lower windows now below ground, their upper story doors now opening to the new street level. Their skywalks, their elevated pedestrian connectors, now floating 10, 12, 15 feet above a pavement that was poured on top of a world nobody talks about. Now here is where this investigation becomes genuinely extraordinary, because the mudflood alone, as dramatic as it is, does not explain the full picture. Let us talk about what these elevated structures were part of. When you study urban planning history, there is a concept called multi-level urbanism. It refers to cities that deliberately organized human movement across vertical strata, not just on the ground, but above it, below it, and through it simultaneously. Modern examples include the elevated walkway systems of Hong Kong, the L-train network of Chicago, and the +15 skyway system in Calgary, which connects over 60 city blocks at the second-story level. These are considered extraordinary innovations, marvels of modern planning. But look at what the pre-mudflood evidence suggests. In Venice, a city built on water and also a city whose lower floors have been slowly sinking and being reclaimed by the lagoon for centuries, there exists an entire network of passages called sottoporteggi, covered walkways that pass through the ground floors of buildings, connecting streets and canals. Historians date these to the medieval period. But several of them are built with a sophistication, with barrel vaults, with inlaid stone floors, with drainage channels, that medieval Venice simply did not have the engineering capacity to produce. Unless medieval Venice was not building them, unless they were inheriting them. In Edinburgh, the story becomes even more explicit. Beneath the Royal Mile, the main ceremonial street of the Scottish capital, there exists an entire buried city, Mary King's Close, a neighborhood of streets, homes, shops and taverns that was sealed, filled to its ceiling with debris and landfill, and built over in the 1600s. You can tour it today. You walk through rooms where the ceiling is the floor of the building above, where the windows, once at street level, now look into solid stone. That was a deliberate act of urban burial, official, documented, done by city authorities who decided it was more convenient to fill in an entire neighborhood than to maintain it. Which raises an obvious question. What were they filling it with? Where did the material come from? And why, if this was simply an urban renewal project, do the architectural details of the buried buildings exceed the quality of the buildings built on top of them? The quality goes down, not up. The buried city is better than the city built to replace it. And the skywalks, the elevated connectors between upper floors of buildings across the street from each other, those appear in the buried city too, in the upper stories of buildings that are now entirely underground. What we are looking at is not medieval engineering. What we are looking at is the top 3 stories of a civilization that had at least 5 or 6 stories beneath it. A civilization that moved across rooftops and connected its upper levels the way we connect our streets. A civilization for whom the elevated level was the main level. The street level we have today, the one we treat as the base of civilization, was their upper floor. Let us talk about the iron. Because if you accept that some of these elevated structures are genuinely ancient, or at least significantly older than the civilization that claims to have built them, then you have to explain the iron. Wrought iron as a large-scale building material is conventionally dated to the late 18th century in terms of structural application. Cast iron bridges, iron-framed buildings, iron railings and balustrades as architectural features, these are categorized as Industrial Revolution innovations, early 1800s at the absolute earliest for widespread use. And yet, in cities across southern Europe, the Middle East and South Asia, there are iron connectors embedded in masonry that predate those timelines by what the buildings themselves suggest are centuries. Not just iron pins and tie rods, those have been used since antiquity. I am talking about fabricated iron components, prefabricated brackets, repeating modular connectors of a complexity that implies production at scale. There is a site in Rajasthan, India, not widely discussed in mainstream archaeology, where an elevated walkway segment approximately 40 meters long connects 2 structures across a gap. The walkway floor is gone. What remains are the iron support structures, embedded into both buildings at exactly the same height, with brackets of identical design, spaced at intervals that correspond to a standard module, a repeating unit of measurement. Standardized, modular, prefabricated iron structures at an elevation that implies a pedestrian network, not a decorative feature, not a later addition, but an original, integral component of the building's design. The iron is the same age as the stone. The mortar around the embedded brackets is continuous with the original wall construction. This is not a retrofit. This is not a later addition. This was built as one unified system. Now, who had the iron production capacity to build modular, standardized, prefabricated pedestrian infrastructure at scale across an entire city before the Industrial Revolution? The official answer is nobody. The evidence says somebody. Here is where this gets political. Here is where this stops being archaeology and starts being a question about power. Because if these skywalks existed, if there was a seamless elevated pedestrian network connecting the upper stories of a vertically integrated pre-Mudflood city, who was using it? Consider the implication of elevation in every pre-modern culture on Earth. Height equals status. The palace is on the hill. The temple is on the mountain. The aristocracy lives above the street. The common people live on the street in the noise, the filth, the mud, the chaos. An elevated pedestrian network, one that allowed movement across an entire city above the street, would not have been egalitarian infrastructure. It would have been the private transit system of a ruling class. Think about what that means in practical terms. The elite of this pre-Mudflood civilization could move through their city without ever touching the ground floor, without interacting with the general population below, without exposure to the commerce, the smells, the disease, the disorder of street-level life. They lived above, they moved above, they governed from above. And when the mudflood came, when the silt rose and swallowed the lower levels, burying the street-level world of the common population, the upper-level network remained, partially, fragmentarily, because the buildings were tall enough that their upper stories protruded above the new sediment horizon. And the people who survived on those upper levels, the ones who were already living at elevation, they simply rebranded what they were standing on. The old street became the new basement. The old second floor became the new ground floor. The old skywalk became the new ornamental arch. The old rooftop garden became the new courtyard. And they told the survivors, the people who clawed their way up from the mud, that this was always how it was, that these buildings had always looked like this, that those floating doorways were always decorative, that the iron connectors were always just structural ornamentation. They buried a world and told the survivors they were living in the original one. The final proof, and I use that word carefully because what I am presenting is evidence and not courtroom certainty, and I ask you to weigh it accordingly, the final proof is the distribution. If orphan thresholds were purely local phenomena, if they were the result of local drainage projects, local urban renewal, local quirks of building tradition, then they would cluster in specific regions with specific geological or historical explanations. They do not cluster, they pattern. They appear on every continent with a pre-industrial urban tradition. They appear at consistent elevations, typically between 8 and 20 feet above modern street level, regardless of local geography. They appear with consistent architectural language, arches, corbels, iron connectors, load-bearing lintels, regardless of local building tradition. The architectural vocabulary of the orphan threshold is global. That means whatever produced it was also global. A civilization or a network of civilizations sharing engineering knowledge that spanned the inhabitable world, that built vertically, that moved at elevation, that connected its cities not just horizontally across land but vertically across stories. A civilization with standardized iron production, standardized modular building systems, and an urban philosophy so different from ours that we literally cannot recognize their infrastructure when we are standing inside it. And then an event, catastrophic, geological, possibly coordinated with something astronomical, something cyclical, something the archaic astronomers were trying to warn us about in every monument we have misidentified as a religious site. The silt rose. The lower world drowned. And the survivors, inheriting the upper floors of a civilization they did not build and could not fully understand, looked out from those elevated thresholds at a new, raw, silted world and made a decision. They did not tell the truth. They said, this is where we began. The skywalks are still there, suspended between the world they came from and the world that buried it. Every city you have ever walked through is a palimpsest, A manuscript written over a previous manuscript, imperfectly erased, with the old words still bleeding through. The thresholds are still there, the iron is still there. The corbels and the arches and the load-bearing lintels built for a traffic that no longer passes through them are still there. All you have to do is look up. I know that is harder than it sounds. We have been trained not to. We have been rewarded for keeping our eyes at street level, for accepting the horizon they gave us, for never asking why the door is floating 20 feet above where a door has any business being. But you are watching this video, which means something in you already looked up. Do not stop. The research continues. The locations I have not discussed yet, and there are dozens, will be in the next video. If you have photographs, coordinates, or architectural anomalies in your own city that fit this pattern, put them in the comments below. This is collective archaeology. This is the kind of investigation that only works when thousands of eyes are pointed at the same question. Subscribe, share this with one person who you think is ready to look up. Because the Skywalks are waiting. And somewhere below your feet, the world they connected is waiting too.